What red flag did everyone tell you to ignore? I was picking up my 8-month-old son Andrew from my mother-in-law's house when he started pointing at his socks. When I took them off, both of his tiny feet were bright red with blisters forming on the soles and between his toes. My mother-in-law Lizzie stood behind me. Oh, the bathwater must have been a bit warm today. You know how sensitive baby skin is. I drove straight to the emergency room where the doctor confirmed second-degree burns and said the pattern suggested sustained exposure, not accidental splashing. He asked if I wanted to file a report, but when I explained it happened at Grandma Lizzie's house, his whole demeanor changed. These family situations are complicated. Maybe she just didn't test the water properly. The nurse started to write something then stopped. Keeling? As in City Council Keeling? The one who ran that special daycare program? She exchanged a look with the doctor. I'm sure she just made an honest mistake. I called my sister-in-law Jill that night. Her daughter had stayed with Lizzie last summer. Did Heather ever have any injuries? Her feet were really red once. Mom said it was from playing barefoot in the yard. The next morning I told my husband we couldn't leave Andrew with his mother anymore. I expected him to take my side, but he exploded. Are you calling my mom an abuser? She raised 3 kids. I hadn't even told him the reason yet. Either way, I showed him the ER report, and he just ripped it up like he'd been expecting this. She watches him for free while you work. You want to pay $2,000 a month for daycare instead? I'd already called every daycare within an hour of my job. I couldn't afford a nanny and my mom lived across the country. If I missed another week of work, I'd be fired. So the next morning, I had no choice but to take Andrew back to Lizzie's. But this time I had a plan. Nothing fancy, just a small camera in his diaper bag. She smiled at me from her doorway. Accidents happen, dear. Maybe you should trim his nails so he doesn't scratch the blisters. The way she said accidents made my skin crawl. And when I checked the camera that evening, the memory card was missing. She'd found it. I filed a report with CPS, but they said without proof of intent, grandmother care fell under family discretion. The investigator actually suggested I was experiencing postpartum paranoia. Even my pediatrician wouldn't write a letter supporting my concerns because Lizzie had been his kid's piano teacher for 20 years. That weekend, Lizzie sent a text to the family group chat. Since some people think I'm dangerous, I guess I won't be hosting Sunday dinners anymore. My phone exploded. His sisters called me a monster. His father said I was disrespecting their family. My husband slept on the couch. The entire family turned against me for hurting Mom's feelings. Meanwhile, Andrew's feet were still peeling and I had no idea why. Monday morning came. I had to work or lose my job. I drove Andrew to Lizzie's, hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I picked him up that evening, there were fresh red marks on his ankles. Grip marks. He was fussy during his bath, Lizzie explained with that same sick smile. Some babies just don't like being clean. I sat in my car and sobbed. I'd tried everything legal. My baby was being hurt, and everyone was protecting her. That night, I called my brother Victor, who'd just got out of prison. Did 8 years for something I'm not allowed to talk about. I need your help, I told him. No questions asked. Victor had friends. By Wednesday, everything was arranged. I dropped Andrew at emergency daycare and parked by the grocery store. At 9:03, Lizzie pulled into her usual spot. At 9:04, a van pulled up beside her. At 9:05, she was inside it. Victor's friend had a warehouse by the river. When I walked in, Lizzie was zip-tied to a metal chair, duct tape over her mouth. The same kind of metal tub she'd used for Andrew's baths sat in front of her, steam rising from the water. Her eyes went wide when she saw me testing the temperature. Perfect, I said. Just how you like it. I pulled the tape off her mouth. You're going to tell me exactly why you burned my baby's feet. I moved the tub closer. The steam hit her face. Her whole body was shaking now. 5 seconds. She opened her mouth to scream, but Victor's friend put his hand over it. 4, 3, 2, 1. The word barely left my mouth before Lizzie started sobbing so hard her whole body shook against the zip ties. Snot ran down her face as she gasped out words between hiccups about how Andrew needed to be strong like her boys. She kept saying modern parents made kids too soft and weak. The words tumbled out faster and faster about how she'd done it on purpose with the hot water. She thought the heat would toughen him up and make him stop being so fussy all the time. My legs felt like they might give out as I stepped back from the metal tub. The steam kept rising between us while I tried to understand what I was hearing. This woman actually believed she was helping my baby by burning his feet. Victor's friend kept his thick hand close to her mouth in case she tried to scream. His eyes stayed on me while I stood there shaking and trying to process her sick logic. My phone was already in my pocket and I pulled it out with numb fingers. The record button turned red as I held it up to catch every word coming out of her mouth. She didn't even notice the camera through her tears as she kept talking about her methods. She told me the exact water temperature she used was 115 degrees. She said she'd hold their feet in for 30 seconds at a time to build tolerance. Her own kids had gotten the same treatment when they were babies, and look how they turned out. She actually sounded proud as she described doing this to my husband and his brothers. The confession kept pouring out while tears and snot covered her face. She explained how she'd start with shorter times and work up to longer exposures. Each word made my stomach turn, but I kept recording and getting close-ups of her face. Victor's friend started shifting his weight and looking at the door every few seconds. His boots scraped against the concrete floor as he paced back and forth. I held up 5 fingers to show him we needed more time. He nodded but kept watching the door like he expected cops to burst through any second. I moved closer to Lizzie and asked about the camera I'd hidden in Andrew's diaper bag. Her crying slowed down as she admitted she'd found it right away that morning. She said she couldn't let me make trouble over something so small. She'd thrown the memory card in her garbage disposal to destroy the evidence. Being a good grandmother meant teaching babies to be tough even if parents didn't understand. The grip marks from the zip ties were turning her wrists purple and red. I made sure to get video of those marks along with the chair in the warehouse. Every detail might matter later if things went bad. I leaned down close enough to smell the fierce sweat coming off her skin. My voice stayed calm as I told her she'd never touch Andrew again. If she came near him or tried anything, I'd make sure everyone saw this video. Her eyes went huge as she finally understood what was happening here. She realized I had real leverage now, and there was nothing she could do about it. We pulled the metal tub away from her but left her tied to the chair. Victor's friend said he'd cut her loose in an hour after we were gone. That would give us time to get far away before she could call anyone. I took photos of everything, including the warehouse address painted on the wall. The chair she sat in and the tub we'd threatened her with got documented too. My hands shook so bad I could barely hold the phone steady for the pictures. Back in my car, I couldn't stop my fingers from trembling as I uploaded the video. 3 different cloud services got copies along with an encrypted email account I'd set up. The backup took forever on my phone's data connection, but I waited for each one. My whole body felt like it might fall apart from what I'd just done. The emergency daycare was only 10 minutes away, but the drive felt like hours. Andrew reached for me the second he saw me walk through the door. I held him so tight against my chest that he started squirming to get free. His little hands pushed against my shoulders while he made unhappy noises. The daycare director walked over with a folder full of paperwork in her hands. She mentioned they might have a permanent spot opening up next week if I could get everything submitted. The forms would need to be in by Friday to secure his place. I nodded and took the papers while trying to keep my voice normal. At home, my husband's car was already in the driveway, even though he should have been at work. He met me at the door with his face red and his hands balled into fists. His mom had called him crying about someone threatening her this morning. He wanted to know where I'd been and what I knew about it. I shifted Andrew to my other hip and looked him straight in the eyes. Maybe his mom should think about why someone would want to threaten her. The words came out steady, even though my insides felt like jelly. That night, after Andrew finally fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and started typing out every single word from the video. My fingers moved fast across the keyboard while I played and replayed the recording on my phone. The timestamp showed 9:17 a.m. when Lizzie admitted she'd done this to her own boys when they were babies. She said my husband used to cry for hours after his baths, but it made him tougher in the end. I typed that part 3 times to make sure I got every word right. The document grew to 5 pages with exact quotes about temperatures and how long she'd hold their feet under. I wondered if my husband's brothers knew what their mother had done to them as babies. My eyes burned from staring at the screen, but I kept going until I had everything documented with timestamps and notes about her facial expressions. The clock on the microwave showed 11:47 p.m. when I finally saved the file to 3 different folders on my computer. I couldn't sleep that night and kept getting up to check the locks on all the doors and windows. My brain wouldn't stop replaying the warehouse and the way Lizzie's face looked when she realized I had real leverage. Around 1 a.m., I checked on Andrew for the 4th time and found myself standing over his crib just watching him breathe. The house made normal settling noises, but each one made me jump and check the windows again. At 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and went back to my laptop to create another backup of everything. I found an old flash drive in the junk drawer and copied all the files onto it. The little light blinked while it transferred, and I kept looking over my shoulder even though I knew nobody was there. I wrapped the flash drive in a plastic bag and tucked it deep inside Andrew's diaper bag, between the spare clothes and wipes where nobody would think to look. The next morning, my husband came into the kitchen already dressed for work and announced he was taking Andrew to his mother's house to sort this whole thing out. I moved in front of Andrew's high chair and told him that wasn't happening because his mother had admitted on video to hurting our son on purpose. He stepped closer and his face got red the way it does when he's really mad. I didn't move from my spot blocking Andrew's chair while my husband demanded to see the supposed proof I had. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and found the audio file I'd extracted from the video. His mother's voice filled the kitchen talking about burning all 3 of her boys' feet to toughen them up and make them less fussy. The color drained from his face as he listened to his own mother describe holding him underwater as a baby. But then he shook his head and said, I must have tricked her somehow or edited the recording to make her sound bad. He grabbed his keys and stormed out while I stood there holding Andrew, who was trying to grab my phone. I called the emergency daycare right away to confirm Andrew's spot for the rest of the week. The director answered on the 3rd ring, and I explained I needed to make sure his spot was secure through Friday. She said they were impressed by how I was handling such a difficult family situation, and Andrew was welcome as long as I needed. My phone started buzzing with texts before I even hung up with the daycare. His sisters were calling me evil and saying I'd attacked their poor mother who'd done nothing but love us. The messages kept coming faster than I could read them with words like monster and ungrateful and psycho. I didn't respond to any of them but took screenshots of every single message for my records. The family group chat exploded with his aunts and cousins joining in to say how horrible I was for hurting sweet Lizzie. By noon, I had 43 screenshots saved in a folder labeled harassment. I found a family attorney through Google who specialized in custody and protective orders and managed to get an appointment that afternoon. Her office was in a building downtown, and I brought everything including the medical records and photos of Andrew's burned feet. She watched parts of the video with her face getting more serious with each minute. She said the confession was problematic legally since it was obtained under duress, but the medical evidence was solid enough for a protective order. She pulled out forms and started filling them out while explaining the process would take a few days. The attorney filed for an emergency protective order that would require supervised visitation only between Lizzie and Andrew. She looked me in the eye and warned that the warehouse incident could backfire badly if it came out in court. I nodded and said I understood the risks, but I had to protect my baby from being burned again. She made copies of all my documents and said she'd call as soon as she heard from the judge. 2 days passed with more angry texts from his family and my husband sleeping at his parents' house. My boss called me into his office about my recent absences, and I couldn't hold it together anymore. Tears ran down my face as I explained about Andrew's burns and the family situation and why I'd missed so much work. He handed me tissues and listened without interrupting until I got through the whole story. He wrote down a phone number for the company's employee assistance program and told me to take whatever time I needed to keep my son safe. His wife had gone through something similar with her ex-husband, he said, and he understood how hard this was. I thanked him and went back to my desk feeling lighter, knowing my job was secure for now. That same afternoon, CPS called saying they were reopening the investigation based on new medical documentation my attorney had submitted to them. The woman on the phone sounded different from the first investigator and actually seemed interested in protecting Andrew instead of dismissing my concerns. She scheduled a home visit for the next week and said they'd be conducting a thorough investigation this time, including interviews with other family members who might have witnessed concerning behavior. That night, my husband packed 2 suitcases and left without saying goodbye to Andrew or me. His text came an hour later saying I'd destroyed his entire family, and he couldn't look at me anymore. I texted back that his mother destroyed everything when she burned our baby's feet on purpose. He didn't respond, but I saw the read receipt, so I knew he got it. The house felt empty without him there, even though things had been bad between us for weeks. Andrew crawled around looking for his daddy, and I had to keep myself from crying every time he went to the bedroom door. 3 days later, my attorney called saying the pediatrician's office finally sent over Andrew's complete medical records after her formal request. She read me parts over the phone, and there were notes from 6 months ago about unusual marks on his legs that the doctor wrote off as normal baby bruises. Another note from 4 months ago mentioned red areas on his back that looked like grip marks, but the doctor didn't follow up on it. My attorney said these records would help our case even though the doctor hadn't reported anything at the time. I made copies of everything and put them in my filing system that was getting thicker every day. That same evening, Jill called me from her car whispering that she needed to talk to me about Lizzie. She said she believed everything I was saying about what happened to Andrew because similar things happened to Heather last summer. She wouldn't go on record or talk to CPS, but she wanted me to know I wasn't crazy, and she'd been keeping Heather away from Grandma ever since. She told me about finding burn marks on Heather's arms that Lizzie claimed were from touching the stove, but Jill knew her daughter couldn't reach that high. Before hanging up, she said to be careful because Lizzie had connections everywhere in town. The next morning, I went to the hardware store and bought security cameras for every entrance to my house. I spent the whole afternoon installing them and connecting them to my phone so I could watch from anywhere. 2 days later, I was at work when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the front door camera. The footage showed my husband using his key to get inside, even though I'd asked him to return it when he left. He went through the house taking things that weren't even his, like my grandmother's lamp and some of Andrew's toys. I saved all the footage to multiple places and texted him that I knew he'd been in the house and to return Andrew's toys immediately. He brought them back that night and left them on the porch without knocking. CPS called the next day to schedule their home visit for the following week, and I spent every free minute cleaning and organizing the house. I bought new locks for all the doors and made sure every room was perfect with all of Andrew's medical supplies organized and labeled. The night before the visit, I couldn't sleep and kept checking that everything was ready. The investigator arrived right on time and seemed impressed by how prepared I was with all my documentation in order. She looked at Andrew's healing feet and took photos while making notes about his progress. She asked about my support system, and I told her about the daycare and my boss being understanding about the situation. After an hour, she said everything looked good, and she'd be recommending that Andrew stay in my care with regular check-ins. Right after she left, Victor texted me for the first time in days saying he needed to stay away for a while. Someone had been asking questions about him at his work site, and he thought it was connected to that morning at the warehouse. I texted back that I understood and thanked him for everything he'd done to help protect Andrew. We both knew we couldn't talk for months until things cooled down. I deleted our text conversation and removed his number from my phone just to be safe. My attorney called that afternoon saying Lizzie's lawyer had contacted her office about the situation. She'd hired the most expensive firm in the city, and they were threatening to sue me for defamation if I didn't take back my accusations immediately. My attorney said not to worry because they were just trying to scare me and we had solid evidence on our side. She drafted a response saying we stood by everything and had medical documentation to support our claims. The emergency daycare director called me the next morning with good news about Andrew's spot becoming permanent. She mentioned quietly that she'd heard about the Keeling family's difficult reputation from other parents over the years. Apparently, several families had pulled their kids from programs Lizzie was involved with, but nobody would say why publicly. This made me realize Andrew and Heather weren't the only kids she'd hurt over the years. I felt sick thinking about all the children who might have suffered, because everyone protected Lizzie's reputation. 2 days later, a detective called my cell, asking about an alleged incident at a warehouse involving Lizzie. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about, and gave him my attorney's number for any other questions. He said he might need to talk to me again, but for now he was just doing preliminary investigation. My hands were shaking when I hung up, but I knew I'd said the right things. My attorney called back within an hour saying the detective had contacted her and she'd handled it. She advised me to give the confession video to CPS, but definitely not to the police since it could protect Andrew while keeping my legal exposure limited. I made another backup of the video on a flash drive before taking the original to the CPS office that afternoon. The supervisor called me back 2 hours later, and I could hear papers shuffling through the phone while he told me they'd watched the video with their whole team and found it deeply disturbing. He said they'd be interviewing all of Lizzie's grandchildren immediately and looking for patterns going back years. I hung up feeling both relieved and sick, because this meant other kids had probably suffered too. The next morning, I pulled into the employee parking lot and noticed my husband's father sitting in his truck near the entrance just watching me walk into the building. He didn't approach or say anything, but his presence made my skin crawl, so I told security about it. They walked out to talk to him, and I watched from the window as he argued with them before finally driving away. He came back during my lunch break and parked in the same spot again. Security had to escort him off the property, and this time they called the police to file a trespassing report. The third day, he showed up right as I was leaving and followed me halfway home before turning off at a red light. HR called me into a meeting that afternoon where they explained that the situation had become too disruptive, and they needed to put me on paid administrative leave while they figured out a safety plan. At least I'd still get my paycheck while staying home with Andrew, which a relief since I didn't have to worry about childcare anymore. My attorney called that evening saying the protective order hearing got scheduled for next week, and the judge would watch Lizzie's confession video in his private chambers to protect the criminal investigation. She sounded confident that we'd get the order based on the medical evidence alone, but the video would seal it. I was making Andrew's bottle when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end said she was my husband's brother's ex-wife, and she'd heard about what happened with Lizzie. She told me she left him partly because of how Lizzie treated their kids during visits, and she'd be willing to testify about the patterns she saw. She described finding strange bruises on her daughter after staying with Grandma, and how everyone dismissed her concerns just like they did mine. We talked for an hour, and she gave me dates and details that matched up with times Lizzie had been alone with other grandchildren. My husband texted me that night for the first time in days, asking if he could see Andrew somewhere without his mother present. I agreed to meet him at the CPS office for a supervised visit, since I wanted someone official there to witness everything. When he walked into the visitation room, Andrew reached for him immediately, and my husband's face just crumpled. He held Andrew so carefully and kept examining his little feet, which were finally starting to look normal again. He didn't say sorry or admit he was wrong, but he did tell me he needed time to process everything, because his whole childhood suddenly made sense now. The way he said it made me wonder what memories were surfacing for him about his own mother. He stayed the full hour just holding Andrew, and when the visit ended, he handed him back without arguing. The detective called my cell the next morning saying Lizzie had filed a complaint about unlawful confinement and wanted to press charges. My attorney had already prepared for this, and told me not to worry since there was no evidence, and it was just Lizzie's word against nobody's. She said desperate people make desperate moves, and this complaint actually helped our case by showing Lizzie's vindictive nature. I turned on the local news that night and nearly dropped my coffee when I saw the headline about trouble in the Keeling family, though they didn't have any real details yet. A blogger emailed me an hour later saying she was investigating the story and wanted my side, but I deleted it without responding. My attorney had warned me not to talk to any media since it could hurt our case and give Lizzie's lawyers ammunition against us. The CPS supervisor called again the next day with shocking news that 3 more families had come forward after hearing about the investigation. They all had similar stories about their kids getting hurt during visits with Lizzie over the past decade, but nobody had connected the dots before. One family had photos of burns on their toddler's hands from 5 years ago that Lizzie had explained as a cooking accident. Another family had medical records showing their son's repeated ear infections that mysteriously stopped after they quit letting him stay overnight at Grandma's house. The third family's daughter had developed severe anxiety around bath time after spending a week with Lizzie, but they'd never understood why until now. The investigation was expanding way beyond just Andrew and becoming about Lizzie's whole pattern of hurting children while everyone looked the other way because of her reputation. The supervisor said they were building a comprehensive case file and would be recommending criminal charges to the district attorney's office. He thanked me for having the courage to come forward, because without that video confession, they never would have gotten the other families to speak up. I felt validated, but also angry that it took this long and this much evidence for anyone to take it seriously. My attorney called me into her office 2 days later and spent 3 hours going over exactly what I could and couldn't say in court. She had me practice answering questions about Andrew's injuries while she played the role of both friendly and hostile lawyers. She kept stopping me whenever I started to mention anything beyond the medical facts and told me to stick to dates and doctor reports. She made me repeat the timeline of Andrew's burns over and over until I could say it without getting emotional. She showed me photos of Andrew's feet that would be presented as evidence and coached me on how to react calmly when I saw them. She reminded me 20 times that if anyone asked about the warehouse, I should say I didn't know what they were talking about. She had me practice that response until it sounded natural and confused rather than defensive. She went through every possible question Lizzie's lawyer might ask and drilled me on keeping my answers short and factual. She explained that the judge would review Lizzie's confession video privately and that I shouldn't reference it unless directly asked. She told me to wear something conservative and to keep my hands folded in my lap so I wouldn't fidget. The night before the hearing, I couldn't force myself to eat anything and just sat in Andrew's room watching him sleep. His little feet looked so normal now after weeks of healing, but I noticed how he still pulled them away when I changed his socks. I held him for hours in the rocking chair and whispered promises that after tomorrow, he'd be safe forever. I must have checked the clock every 10 minutes, and each time felt like an hour had passed. I tried to sleep but kept jolting awake with nightmares about the judge siding with Lizzie. Around 4 a.m, I gave up and just sat at the kitchen table going over my notes from the attorney. I dressed Andrew in his softest outfit and made sure to bring extra bottles and his favorite toy for the wait. The courthouse was packed when we arrived, and I had to push through reporters who'd heard about the council member's case. Inside the courtroom, the judge spent 40 minutes reviewing all the medical evidence while Lizzie sat at her table looking small and old. He called a recess to review the confession video in his chambers, and when he came back, his face looked like he'd seen something horrible. Lizzie's lawyer kept shuffling papers and whispering urgently to her, but she just stared straight ahead. The judge cleared his throat and started reading his decision in a voice that got harder with each word. He granted a 2-year protective order that meant Lizzie couldn't come within 500 feet of Andrew or have any unsupervised contact. He ordered her to undergo a full psychological evaluation and complete a year of parenting classes before any review of the order. He said the evidence showed a clear pattern of intentional harm that put the child at serious risk. Lizzie suddenly stood up and started wailing about how she'd dedicated her life to children, and this would destroy her reputation. She kept saying she was just trying to help, and that modern parents were too soft and didn't understand discipline. The judge cut her off and told her she was lucky the district attorney hadn't filed criminal charges yet. He said her position in the community didn't give her the right to hurt children, and that he'd seen the video evidence of her admissions. Outside the courthouse, my husband was waiting by the doors and asked if we could talk privately. He said he was filing for divorce but wanted to work out joint custody of Andrew without fighting in court. I told him we could arrange something as long as he guaranteed his mother would never be around Andrew during his time. He nodded and said he'd already found an apartment on the other side of town away from his parents. He looked broken and older, and for the first time admitted his mother had problems he couldn't ignore anymore. The CPS supervisor met with us that afternoon to create a comprehensive safety plan for Andrew's care going forward. The plan required anyone who wanted unsupervised contact with Andrew to complete therapy and parenting education first. They classified the case as founded for physical abuse, which would stay on Lizzie's record permanently. The supervisor said they'd do monthly check-ins for the first year and quarterly visits after that if everything stayed stable. They gave me a direct number to call if Lizzie tried any contact and promised they'd respond immediately. 3 days later, I went back to work with new security measures the company had arranged after learning about the situation. They assigned me a different parking spot closer to the building, and security walked me to my car each evening. My coworkers were supportive and brought me coffee and checked in constantly, but I could feel them watching me differently. Some looked at me with pity, and others with a kind of fascination like I was a celebrity for all the wrong reasons. My boss moved my desk away from the windows and told me to take whatever time I needed for court dates. The detective called that week to tell me he was closing the warehouse investigation due to insufficient evidence. He said Lizzie had decided not to pursue charges, and that without witnesses or physical evidence there was nothing to investigate. We both knew what really happened, but he said sometimes these things work themselves out without official involvement. He warned me to be careful and suggested I might want to vary my daily routines for a while just to be safe. The local paper ran a story the next day about Lizzie being removed from 2 city council committees pending the outcome of the CPS investigation. They mentioned concerns about a council member's conduct but didn't include names or specific allegations due to privacy laws. Her photo disappeared from the council website, and her name got quietly removed from several community programs she'd been running. I started looking for a therapist the next week and found one who worked with families dealing with abuse situations. Her office was small and had toys in the corner for kids to play with during sessions. She handed me tissues before I even started talking. I told her everything about the warehouse and waited for her to judge me or call the police. Instead, she just nodded and said parents will do anything to protect their children from harm. She helped me understand that my guilt came from being raised to respect authority even when it failed me. We met every Thursday at 4, and slowly I stopped waking up at night in cold sweats. My husband called about signing the custody papers, and we met at a coffee shop near his new apartment. He looked tired and had lost weight since moving out. The papers gave me primary custody with him getting Andrew every other weekend. The main condition was that his mother couldn't be present during his visits or have any contact with Andrew. He signed without arguing and seemed relieved to have clear rules to follow. He even thanked me for being willing to work things out without a big court fight. 6 weeks passed, and Andrew started acting more like himself at the new daycare. The teacher pulled me aside one morning to tell me how much he'd changed since starting there. She said he was reaching for toys without hesitating and laughing during story time. He'd become the happiest baby in the toddler room and loved playing with the other kids. His feet had healed completely, and he didn't flinch during diaper changes anymore. The fear that used to be in his eyes was finally gone. Jill texted me one afternoon asking if she could bring Heather over for a playdate. She showed up with cookies and let the kids play while we sat in the kitchen. She admitted she was planning to divorce my husband's brother because she couldn't trust him around their daughter. We talked about how the whole family protected Lizzie and made excuses for her behavior. She said keeping Heather safe was worth losing the marriage, and I understood completely. We started meeting every week so the cousins could play together safely. The divorce papers came through faster than expected since my husband didn't contest anything. During the final mediation session, he actually admitted his mother had problems he'd ignored for too long. He said he should have listened when I first showed him Andrew's burns. The mediator noted everything for the record, and we signed the final agreements. It was done in less than 20 minutes, after months of pain and fear. My boss called me into her office the next Monday with good news about a promotion. She said she'd watched me handle an impossible situation while never missing deadlines or dropping projects. The senior position came with a 30% raise that would cover my legal bills and therapy costs. She also arranged for me to work from home 2 days a week to help with childcare. The whole team celebrated with cake in the break room that afternoon. Several months went by peacefully until a package arrived at my apartment with Andrew's name on it. Inside was an expensive toy truck with a card signed, "Love, Grandma Lizzie," for his first birthday. I called my attorney immediately, and she filed a report about the protective order violation. The judge reviewed it within days and extended the order for another full year. He warned that any further violations would result in jail time for Lizzie. My ex-husband started texting me insights from his own therapy sessions about his childhood. He was finally seeing how his mother had hurt him and his brothers when they were young. He remembered getting burns on his feet that she said were from hot sand at the beach. He realized she'd trained them all to accept her abuse as normal discipline. Each message showed him understanding more about why I'd done what I did to protect Andrew. He was working hard to break the cycle of abuse for our son's future. A year after everything started, the CPS supervisor called to schedule the final case review meeting. She came to the apartment and spent an hour observing Andrew playing and checking our living situation. She said he was thriving and all the safety measures were working perfectly. The case would be officially closed with a positive outcome noted in their files. She mentioned it was one of the best results she'd seen in a family abuse situation. Before leaving, she gave me her direct number in case we ever needed help again. I was grocery shopping when I ran into the ER doctor who'd first treated Andrew's burns. He stopped his cart and apologized for not taking the situation more seriously that night. He said our case had changed how the whole hospital handled suspected abuse now. They'd implemented new protocols requiring deeper investigation regardless of family status or connections. He said Andrew's case had saved other children from being sent back to dangerous situations. I thanked him and felt something finally close inside me after all those months. 3 weeks later, my ex dropped Andrew off after his first weekend visit at his new place across town. Andrew reached for me from his car seat but wasn't crying or upset like I'd worried he might be. My ex stood there holding the diaper bag and looking at his feet before telling me he'd found a place nowhere near his parents. I watched him drive away and noticed Andrew tracking the car without getting upset. The custody schedule started working better than I expected, with him picking Andrew up every Friday afternoon. He sent photos of them at the park and the zoo, but never mentioned his mother once. I kept waiting for some fight about holidays or birthdays, but he just asked what would work best for Andrew. 6 months passed before Victor finally called from a number I didn't recognize. He asked if he could see Andrew at the park near my apartment the next Saturday. I bundled Andrew up and walked over to find Victor sitting on a bench in work boots and a construction vest. He'd put on some weight and his eyes looked clear for the first time in years. Andrew crawled right over to him, and Victor's whole face changed watching his nephew grab at his calloused fingers. He told me about his new job laying foundations and how he'd been clean for 8 months now. We met at that park every few weeks after that, with Victor bringing little toys from the dollar store. One afternoon, Jill called to tell me that Lizzie's husband had moved out and filed papers. She'd heard from her ex that the old man finally learned what Lizzie did to their boys when they were little. The whole family was splitting into camps, with some still defending Lizzie, and others finally seeing the truth. I started getting coffee with a guy from my building's gym, who always held the door for me when I was struggling with Andrew's stroller. He knew I had a baby from the start, and never acted weird about it. After 3 months of coffee, he asked about Andrew's father, and I told him the whole story. He just nodded and said his sister went through something similar with her ex's family. We took things slow with him coming over for dinner while Andrew played on his mat. Andrew started pulling himself up on the coffee table and taking sideways steps while holding on. One evening in our new place, he just let go and took 4 steps before sitting down hard. He clapped his hands and laughed while I recorded it on my phone. My ex texted that night saying he was proud of how I'd fought for Andrew even when everyone was against me. He admitted his mother's reputation never should have mattered more than our son's safety. More time passed, and suddenly Andrew was running everywhere and saying new words every day. The preschool down the street had an opening, and I toured it with Andrew on my hip. The teacher showed us the reading corner and the playground while Andrew pointed at everything. On his first day, he walked right in without looking back while I stood in the parking lot crying. His teacher sent photos of him finger painting and playing with blocks. She mentioned at pickup how well-adjusted he seemed for such a young child. 2 years flew by with Andrew growing taller and talking nonstop about his friends at the school. I planned his 3rd birthday party at the community center and invited everyone who actually cared about him. Victor showed up early to help set up tables while my boyfriend hung streamers from the ceiling. Jill brought Heather, who was teaching Andrew to play tag while the other kids arrived. My ex came with his girlfriend, and they both helped serve cake to the squealing 3-year-olds. I stood by the door watching Andrew blow out his candles, surrounded by people who would never hurt him. The warehouse felt like something from another person's life, even though I knew it had brought us here. Every choice I'd made led to this room full of laughter, and kids with frosting on their faces. Andrew ran over and grabbed my hand to pull me toward the cake table. Kinda wild how time just flew by there, 2 years gone and only a few sentences. Stuff like that always gets me. I'll catch you in the next one. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.